Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ERP series, A Bridge Over Troubled Waters, Implementing Your ERP Plan. This is series 3 in the ERP webinar series. It's 3 of 3, so it's our last one with Tom Gordon. My name is Jeff Wilkins. I'm a supply chain program manager with Missouri Enterprise. We're a NIST MEP center. Our purpose here at Missouri Enterprise is to support manufacturers, help them grow in our state. And we do that through a variety of solutions such as business planning, industry certifications, continuous improvement, technology assessments, and a lot more. So what that means for you is we are manufacturing experts that help you in subject matters here in Missouri, but we are connected with a national network through the NIST MEP Center with over 1,800 experts. So whatever you need, we can help fill that need. In some cases, we are fee-based, but being a part of the MEP network allows us to be impact-driven. So it keeps us in business and supporting and helping Missouri manufacturers grow and succeed. We rely on surveys to keep us going. Once we get to the end of today's webinar, there will be a survey link in the chat. If you could please click on that survey link and fill that out. Take 5-10 minutes of your time to fill that out for us. NIST MEP will also follow up with a survey link regarding this webinar and any other projects that we do. And it helps us to deliver impact for you and evaluate that impact. So if you could please take time to fill that out as well. Also, we ask you if you could put your name in and where you're in the chat and your name in and also where you're from. That'd be helpful so we can kind of see who's out here today. And we'll get started from there. I'd like to introduce Tom Gordon. He's our project manager here at Missouri Enterprise, and he'll be talking to you today about our NIST MEP ERP series on the Bridge Over Troubled Waters. So Tom, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep.
Good morning, everyone. This is the third and final webinar. If you remember the first one, we asked why do you want to do this? The second one, we talked about how you realize that dream. This is the third one. What do you do to realize the plan? Webinar 3. So before we start, I want to say something about the generality of this webinar. Implementation is different for every organization because every organization is typically different. Why don't you talk to your ABM about a more in-depth approach, including a system health check or the handbook how to implement an ERP system without losing your hair. One word of warning, be careful not to overload people. This is a tendency in a lot of companies, particularly smaller companies, to actually overload people. So you've selected a system. Now the hard work begins. We've got to work as a team. We've got to support each other. And this is what the implementation is about. So before we go into more detail, let's think about some of the things that cause a failure. And these are taken from the published literature of many, many implementations. So if you underestimate the strategic importance of the implementation, this is a very important tool for your organization. It's not a computer system, it's a tool for your organization. And then we've got to be very careful that you don't bite off more than you can chew. Please don't try and implement 2 big changes at the same time or 3 big changes. And I've seen that. And it really is the recipe for disaster. Don't try and replicate the legacy system on the new software. Because why do you need the new software if you're just going to replicate the legacy system? Remember yesterday, our last webinar, we talked about value stream mapping and really doing some re-engineering of your systems. Don't reinvent the wheel. The TRIZ technique tells us that everything has been developed by somebody. Read the literature. Don't reinvent the wheel. Think about how you're going to manage change. particularly if you've never had an integrated ERP system before. It's a big change in the users' lives. We talked a lot about managing change last time. Please be careful. Another reason to failure is not involving the key stakeholders. We're going to talk about a steering committee, about the different people on the steering committee, which we talked about last week as well. And you've got to involve all the key stakeholders. You've got to use the ERP system for business. Don't ignore the business benefits. Okay. And finally, a big cause of failure is lack of testing, assuming that it all works. So getting those teams productive. I don't know how many of you work in teams, blah, 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 blah. The bigger the company, the more meetings you seem to have. Well, this is taken from an interesting series called Yes, Prime Minister on British television. And the man in front who's looking very smug is the Prime Minister. The chap to his right is the Cabinet Secretary who really runs things. And he makes a point, if it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. He who takes the minutes has the power. So what you need for your teams really is someone who's skilled at facilitating. Stick to the point. Prevent groupthink. And I've fallen into this trap in the past. And also, a good facilitator will make sure that a dominant member does not overwhelm all the other people in the teams. So what's your ideal final result, to use a TRIZ term? Class A, implementation. And really, why accept anything else for your organization? We want excellence. We don't want mediocrity. So the first case study I want to talk about is why I failed in 1981. It's very embarrassing. I understood the computer system, but I did not understand the business system in the factory I was working. An MBA program does not teach self-criticism. I did not understand team think. I remember in one meeting, the purchasing manager yelled at the supplies manager, "Terry, you're thinking with your mouth." You've got to make sure that people do not dominate things and we don't get team think. And finally, I confused my goals with those of the organization. My goal was to get the ERP system implemented as quickly as possible. I also thought that my method of implementation was valid. You know, how can you possibly be so arrogant as to think your method is better than anybody else's? Now, we did reduce inventory. That was a positive thing, but that was as far as we got. It was a Class C implementation. Implementation is a complex and time-consuming task. The traditional waterfall method will prolong the agony, cause frustration, and in worst-case analysis, never actually end. The sequential approach is not really that effective. Now, the next implementation I did in the next factory in the group, I followed the Ollie Wight proven path. This is quite old, and it may seem a little bit old-fashioned to a lot of people, and of course it's extended considerably over time as ERP systems have developed, but some of the basic elements are still vital. Management support, education and training, accurate information, all this sort of stuff. If you do not follow the proven path, who knows where you'll end up. Now, I'm a big believer in the SCRUM Theory. Those of you who are familiar with rugby know what a scrum is. In fact, it's a bunch of people pushing all together as a team, trying to get the ball out of the middle. And you've got this poor little guy called the hooker who is supported by the two props in the front, and his job is purely to get the ball out. But it's a team effort. And that is what Scrum is about. It's about team efforts. It's based on knowledge from experience. It's based on lean thinking, reducing waste and focusing upon essentials. We don't want to institute waste in any form into our implementation or into our system. And of course, the Scrum method is transparent. The base of the Scrum method is sprints. Ideas turned into value. All the work necessary to achieve the organization's goal happens within the sprint. The planning, the reviews, all this sort of stuff. And finally, the goal. The proven path can be adapted to ERP, a sprint breakdown. First and foremost, top left-hand corner, education, training, and continuing education and training. If you think that the cost of education is high, as I said last week, try the cost of ignorance. Please get trained. So, one of the people you want to train is a super user. A super user has an in-depth knowledge of the system, supports all the other users, drives continual improvement, and it helps sustain expertise. The training recommend for a super user is a system boot camp, if your supplier provides that. The APIX, Association of Supply Chain Management, Certified Production Inventory Management, Certified Supply Chain Professional certifications, absolutely invaluable. Also are the APIX conferences and chapter meetings. I really wasn't a big believer in conferences until I started going to the APIX conference. Well, to be honest with you, I was asked to speak at one, so that kind of convinced me the value. But over the years, I've been to many APIX conferences. I also try to go to chapter meetings. Chapter meetings are local, very, very valuable, because you can sit at the bar with someone who's in the same position as you are, and you can talk about it. You know, hey, you know, we've got Tom Gordon helping us to implement our ERP system. What? You must be mad. You know, you get a lot of information from chapter meetings. And then, of course, the published literature. APIX produces a monthly magazine, and also there's loads of published literature. This is what the super user should be focusing on. And then users. Users must have an in-depth knowledge of their applications and their close interactions. We don't want to create silos. That's the worst thing you can do in an ERP system. So the users must have in-depth knowledge. They must also have an overall knowledge of the complete system, what it's trying to do. And again, the APIX chapters, great place for this. And of course, the published literature. Now, the value of a super user. You've got to be very careful. You select someone to be a super user is on a career path in your company. There's nothing more frustrating to an implementer than a super user, once they've learned everything, going to another company. In fact, this happened a few months ago with one of my clients, and I'm still smarting over the fact that this guy who we took a lot of time and effort with left for more money. You know, if I ever see him again, I'll possibly try and break his legs. So in the implementation, the super user is essential, or several of them. You've got to think about sustainability, but it's a very valuable resource. So, which brings us to some basic jobs to be done. I like to think in terms of jobs to be done rather than use the Scrum term sprint. Up there, of course, is risk. We've always got to think about the risk in the system. How are we going to mitigate risk? The sales and operations planning, the customer, what are we doing for the customer? Inventory. If our inventory is not accurate, it's a waste of time. We've got to think about the parameterization of the system. I'm not talking about customization, I'm talking about built-in parameters, and we'll talk about this in a moment. We've got to get the bill of materials and the parts detail right. We've got to establish time fences, sensible time fences. We've got to work with our suppliers. We've got to decide where we're going to host our database. We've got to work on capacity. We've got to work on forecasting, and we've got to have a schedule of accounts. And I've put the schedule of accounts at the bottom because that is really the foundation. Because what do you want from your ERP system? All your information. You want to know where you are and what you're doing. So, job to be done, the parameters. I stress this is not customization. It is adapting the system by way of their established parameters. And all systems have these. Perfect example is setting up the shop calendar. Different companies have different times, different breaks. Some work Saturdays, some don't. So you've got to set up a realistic shop calendar which links into the capacity requirements of your system. Other parameters, and there's an example which is a common one. Do you allow posting of transactions after the end of the financial period? Yes or no? Some companies do, some companies don't. So that's a parameter you can set, but it is not customization. It is parameterization, and that's an important distinction. Job to be done, data cleansing. What do you do with the legacy data? Every company, even ones only 2 or 3 years old, has got an awful lot of legacy data. What do you do with it? Do you ignore it? Do you start from scratch? Or do you try and use it to populate the new database? So what are we talking about? We're talking about parts, we're talking about bills of material, we're talking about customer records, supplier records, product information, intellectual property, parts sales. How long do we want to keep our sales information? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What about drawings and specs? What about stuff we have on AutoCAD or Inventor? What are we going to do with all this? So a team or a sub-team has got to start thinking about data collection. And a timely warning. The advantage of an ERP system is that all data is in one place. However, so are the screw-ups. So be careful. Case study 2, and this again happened to me in real life. Be careful when transferring bills of material from a legacy system to another. Be aware and respectful of effectivity dates. Those of you who are involved in bill of material structuring and planning will know that you never erase anything from a bill of material. You simply change the effectivity date. So if you want to know what you put in a product 5 years ago, you simply put in the date of 5 years ago. Unfortunately, when I did this, I had a programmer who did not know about effectivity dates. And we had about 10 years of product information. And he shifted everything in the bill of material over. So we found, actually very embarrassingly, that we had 10 motors in each product, So the thing is, run a costed bill of material report immediately after populating the new bill of material processor. Any errors like this, ignoring the effectivity date, jumps out. So, job to be done, customer requirements analysis. What are the customer's expectations? Do they want access to your system? What about security? Do they want to pay with credit cards? Do they want to order online? Do they want to change orders online? Do they want to check order delivery? Do they want to pay invoices online? All these are issues which your system will address, but you've got to make sure that you know how you're going to address them. And the other job to be done, supplier relationships. We talked in the supplier risk webinar about building strategic relationships with suppliers. There's no such thing as a supplier chain. It's a matrix. So you have got to build relationships with suppliers. The great Ollie Wight said, treat the supplier as the outside department. Share your MPS. The first time I brought this up in a company, they said, oh, Tom, that means they'll know what we're going to do. I said, hey, they know what we're doing anyway, because we're buying parts from them. Let's not be silly. So access to the mass production schedule is great for suppliers. Eliminates, for instance, the major problems with the bullwhip effect, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So we've got to sensibly and monitor lead times and quantities. Monitoring lead times is very important. Lead time is an item on the parts master or the item master file, which we'll talk about in a moment. But if you're buying a product in Maine, then the lead time is going to be different in winter than it is in summer. So don't fall into that trap. So what we want to do is strategic collaborative relationships with suppliers, perhaps strategic alliances or partnership type relationships. Will your system support this? And if so, you need to do it. Job to be done. Basic rules of forecasting. Again, the great Ollie Wight said all forecasts are lucky or lousy, and he was right. You've got to assume that your forecast is wrong. And of course, accuracy decreases with the amount of time involved gathering and analysing data. I'm sure Walmart knows to the ton how many cornflakes they're going to sell this month. But I'm sure they don't know to the packet how many packets of cornflakes they're going to sell in St. Louis this month. So the higher the level of forecasts, the more accurate they are. But you've got to be careful with forecasts. There's two basic forecasting models. All ERP systems at the moment allow you to do the deterministic model. It assumes that the past is the best indicator of the future, and very often it is. But there's many, many futures, and that's why we stress the stochastic model. And if your system, or your system should, allow your triggers to indicate inaccuracy, any bias and any wishful thinking in the forecast. So you've got to think about the stochastic model over the deterministic model. And look at demand forecasting concepts. And of course, anyone who wants these slides can actually get them from their ABM. So I won't go through everything, but forecasting can be strategic, it can be sales and operational, it can be master production schedule and control. It depends on who does it and how accurate and how basic the forecast is going to be. Now, one of the things that you must do to have an effective production system in your ERP environment is to establish time fences. You establish two time fences, today and the demand time fence. That is where you don't change anything. You're operating on customer orders. It's very expensive to change anything between today and the demand time fence. Between the demand time fence and the planning time fence, you're typically addressing forecasting and customer orders. So you can change, you can chop and change, particularly if you've got a good finite scheduling system, which we'll talk about in a moment. But after the planning time fence, going into the future, then you don't care because you've got plenty of time. The secret is making sure that your time fences are accurate, okay? Because you're doing a lot of business based upon your time fences, and you're planning a lot of stuff in production based upon time fences. Another job to be done, parts file and inventory accuracy. Inventory accuracy. You know, it's really quite sad how many companies have inventory to last them until Halley's Comet comes around again. I know, I've been there. So how do you get inventory accuracy? Well, the way to do it is cycle counting. The annual physical inventory we'll talk about in a second, it doesn't work. All it does is balance the books and put a lot of errors into it. Then you've got to think about the item or the parts file considerations, part numbers, descriptions, institutionalizing waste in your parameters. And remember, if you cannot find it, you haven't got it. I had an interesting experience with a company in Kansas City. I asked the production manager what his inventory accuracy was, and he says, oh, it's terrible, it's about 50%. And then I asked the CFO what inventory accuracy was. He said, oh, it's 100%, Tom, always 100%. Were they kidding ourselves or kidding me? No, they weren't. The CFO he was talking about the book value. The manufacturing director was talking about not being able to find stuff. But of course, on the physical inventories, everything was dragged out and counted. So the CFO was right as well. So be very careful about your parameters. So case study in inventory accuracy. Annual physical inventory, it's a pain. Stops production, releases hordes of people into the stores. It focuses on the dollars, and typically it creates more inaccuracy because you have people who don't know all the parts and cannot count them. You flood the stores with people who can read, write, and some can count. The first big indication I had of the idiocy of this was when I was in Hawker Siddeley Aviation many years ago. The high headlands decided we were all going to go in one weekend and we were going to count inventory. So we all turned up at 6 o'clock on the Saturday morning, everybody, and we're all in the stores counting the inventory. And at noon, all us peons went down to the fish and chip shop for lunch. The top people went to the cricket club for a liquid lunch. At about 3 o'clock, my boss came up and he comes to me and he says, well, how's it going, Tom? And I said, oh, we're getting through it. We're being very keen to get the counts absolutely right. And he said, well, I've got a tee off time in half an hour, so I'm going home. What did that do to me? I said, oh, there's 15 in there, there's 20 in there. You know, annual physical inventories do not work. Cycle counting works. ABC analysis, all systems allow you to do this based upon usage and value. You have periodic counting by experts. And it's also always a good idea not to have the cycle counters reporting to the stores management. Let them report to the CFO. You cycle count every part throughout the year. Some parts you count more. The critical parts you count more. And because it's short periods, any inaccuracies can be followed up. You've got to give responsibility and authority to the people in the stores. Their job is to make sure that the parts are there in the right place, in the right quantities. That's what their job does. That's what storemen do. If you give the people responsibility and authority, then 100% accuracy is possible. I never believed this until I was actually instrumental in achieving this. And we achieved it through help from an organization from Minneapolis called Carlson Marketing, who use their catalog as incentives to the stores people. So, part numbering system. Part numbers. A meaningful part number tends to be a descriptor, and that's great if you can understand it. 24789/big1/John Welding. What on earth does that mean to most people? Absolutely nothing. It only means something to the people who use it every day. Non-meaningful part numbers are a better way to go. 789 is a part number. The description field, big one. The supplier, John Welding. The commodity code, 24, mild steel or something like that. Now, your ERP system will allow you to do this. And you can sort your part item file on anything you like. And if you are sensible about the descriptor field, perhaps using keyword in context or keyword out of context, it makes life a lot easier for everybody. So the item master file or the parts master file, they all have a number of parameters. You've got to be careful what you put in here. Some of these parameters, typically lead times, which vary, batch sizes, which can vary, particularly today when nobody can get anything. Economic order quantity, if you're still stuck in the dark ages with a square root sign. Quality yield, quantity on hand, quantity available, nettable quantity, standard cost. All these things reside in the parts or the item master file. Some of the people who should be involved in creating this: engineering. part number, description, commodity code, unit of measure, drawing number, effectivity date, where used, purchasing and production, batch sizes, lead times, vendors, pegging, finance, standard costing, cycle counters, inventory records, inventory levels, and of course sales with a customer. So it is definitely a multifunctional exercise getting the parts or item master file correct. A case study in doing it wrong. One factory, Bob was my IT manager. Lovely man. He was actually best man at my wedding. He's still a close friend. But when we were implementing actually ASK Man, he was helping to create the item master file, and he stuck his head out of his door and shouted, "Tom, what shall I put in here for the yield percentage?" And I was walking in the opposite direction, thinking about something else, and I says, "Oh, put 95% in, Bob." What did Tom do? Out of ignorance, Tom institutionalized waste. So for every 100 or for every 95 parts we needed, the MRP system told us to make 100. I was institutionalizing waste, and that's something you've got to avoid. Make sure that these parameters, and typically with yield, you want a lot for lot parameter. You only want to make what you need. So don't fall into this trap, which I fell into. So another job to be done is structuring your bill of materials to your environment. If you've got a new system, you might want to think about changing your bills of material. The 4 basic environments: engineer to order, manufacture to order, assemble to order, and manufacture to stock. Today, you might be in an engineer to order or a manufacture to order environment, but with a good ERP system and a good bill of material processor, you might be able to go to an assemble to order environment, and that will give you a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So think about how your environment is going to change with your new system. Job to be done, bill of material accuracy. You should audit your bills of material. And the easiest and quickest way to do this is to go into finished goods stores with a list of the bill of materials, parts, and take it apart. Check to see what you've actually put into the finished product. Another good way is to review miscellaneous issues and miscellaneous receipts. A bill of material error really doubles up errors. If you've got an error on a bill of material, the kitting list tells you to pick one thing, it goes out onto the shop, and then the people say they haven't got that part they need, so they go into stores and get another one. What do they do with the part that was kitted? Hey, they just shove it under the bench or something. Or perhaps if they're real disciplined, they take it back to the stores. So miscellaneous issues, miscellaneous receipts are a great way to evaluate your bill of material accuracy. Now, does the bill of material reflect the ideal way to manufacture your product? A good ERP system with a good bill of material processor will allow you to use things like phantoms, which you don't stock, you build on the line. You perhaps want to restructure your bills of material to better serve your customers. For further information on this, Missouri Enterprise has got a bill of material training program, which is kind of fun. The next job to be done, and of course at the same time, because we're doing all this in parallel, is capacity. We're talking about 4 levels of capacity: rough resource requirements planning or resource planning. This is at the sales and operation level. Is it realistic? The sales and operations plan comes from the strategic plan. Are we kidding ourselves? Are we thinking that we can make 10 million computer chips in a factory the size of, I don't know, a Starbucks coffee shop? Are we kidding ourselves? And at the next level, once we've got RP right, we do rough good capacity planning. This is master planning. Is it realistic what we can do in this manufacturing period? That drives the master production schedule, which is what we're going to use or what we go to drive production. Then, of course, the mass production schedule is input to the MRP. The MRP will tell us what to make and what to buy. Capacity requirements planning will tell us if the MRP is realistic. And finally, production activity control, scheduling. Can we really do it? However correct all those plans are, they've got to be iterative processes because things change. So capacity in the shop, how do we know? Well, two ways. One is demonstrated capacity, what we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 months, and then average it out, or we can calculate capacity based on availability, utilization, and efficiency. Your ERP system will allow you to do both. A good way to start is with demonstrated capacity, and then carry on into calculated capacity. Particularly with demonstrated capacity, you get an idea of the efficiency of the processes, and that's a major element in the calculated capacity equation. Capacity planning. In the good old days, we used to use infinite capacity planning. We assumed, and that's a lovely word, isn't it? We assumed that if rough cut capacity planning at the MPS level was okay, then it is up to the production people on the shop floor to sort out the local issues. That's why we have foremen on the shop floor, of course. A better way, which most modern ERP systems offer, is finite capacity planning. This allows everyone to manage demand and capacity. And very often in the good systems, this is all pictorial, so you don't really have to be able to read and write. You can just look at the graphs on the system. The next job to be done is hardware. Who needs what and where? We made initial assessments in the phase 2, remember, a week ago. But as it changed, now we've got a system, we've selected a system. Do we want GUIs on the shop floor? How are we going to host stuff? How are we going to take security and backup, particularly if we allow remote access? What are we going to do about all that? Big job to be done. And this is where IT, of course, is pulled in and their help is required. And then the software installation, the next job to be done. This is the hard bits. The first thing you've got to do is to get a test database. Many companies don't allow you to have a test database remote from the real database. So the question to ask them is, why? This should be in your system requirements document, of course. We need a test database to play about with, to train, use to practice and test. The real database is where we put the real data. And this is the system that will actually go live when we switch over. Job to be done, boardroom simulation. It's a good and instructive and very much a fun activity as a first pass boardroom simulation. Draw out your factory on the boardroom table. Populate the inventory with Lego parts. Build bills of material, little Lego cars. And then use the computer system in the test database to manufacture Lego cars. Honestly, this works. I first proposed this at a Man conference, oh God, 40 years ago. And I've used it ever since. It's great fun. And one of the good things about this is you can have different teams pretending to run the factory. So if you have, say, a production department, a purchasing department, a quality department, a sales department, swap them over. Have the sales department make the Lego cars so they know what's involved. Have the quality people look at selling the Lego cars. And this is good fun. It allows different people to play unfamiliar functions. Also, make sure that you have something like a fire extinguisher handy, because it's a great way to get people into fights, you know. Then the pre-launch audit. before you go live, there's some things you really got to do. You've got to make sure that your inventory is accurate. If you go live and your inventory is not accurate, then it's a waste of time. Your bills of material have got to be accurate because the system uses the bills of material to pull parts for the shop floor. The master production schedule has got to be agreed. This is what we're going to make in this manufacturing period, lads. And this has got to be agreed by top management and everyone. And remember the time fences. This is between today and the demand time fence. The mass production schedule, it's got to be realistic. We want to make sure that the financial statements are correct. There's nothing more embarrassing than finding out that the new system really doesn't add up the numbers the way the accountants wanted to do. So that's why they've got to be involved in the situation. And finally, the response time for all users. It's very important that we don't have delays in responses on the shop floor, in the offices, because this bores people. So make sure that the response time for all users is what you expect and what the software company has promised you. And then you parallel run. The transition period is really up to you, how confident you feel in the implementation. But the transition period is where all users are involved to make sure that the new system works as planned. We want to get rid of the little black books. There's nothing more frustrating than users who are not really familiar with the new system resort to little black books. I fully remember one factory I went into the production director's office, and against the wall were stacks and stacks of green line flow paper. And I said to him, "What's all that?" And he said, "Oh, it's the weekly MRP run. I get it every Wednesday." So I said, "Well, what do you do with it?" He said, "Oh, I pile it up against the window just in case there's a nuclear war, because I'm told paper absorbs radiation." What a load of baloney. And so I said to him, "Well, how do you schedule the shop?" He said, "Oh," lifted up his little black book and showed me, "This is what I do." So he got this completely pointless computer system when he really ran the shop on the little black books. So get rid of the little black books. The only way to do this is to make sure the users are trained. Audit the results, particularly the financial results, so that we know that we're not putting in any black swans. And finally, at the cutover, get rid of all old system documents. People tend to cling on to them because they think, well, this is how we've always done it. Perhaps I can amend the way I do the new system. Get rid of them all. Make sure that they use the real system. So once you go live, there's a couple of time fences that you want to think about. Go live after 6 months. You want to sit down with the users and the steering committee and say, well, what do we learn? What have we learned from this system? Continue education and training. Are you still learning stuff? Do you still understand how it works? Phase out all the teams except for support. Now, it's very difficult to tell teams to stop working together. Margaret Thatcher found this in 1980 when she democratically grasped power in Britain. One of her things was to reduce the civil service. One of the things she found was there was a team met every month in a very nice restaurant to discuss the progress of the Crimean War. This was in 1980. The Crimean War ended in 1864 with the Treaty of Paris. But these people were still meeting. And as people died, other people were co-opted onto the committee because it was a nice social event. And it's great when you have that team performing like that. But once you've done the task, reward the teams and move on. After about 12 months, utilize the Oliver Wight Checklist for business excellence and grade your system, Class A, B, C, or D. Class D, it's a computer game. Class C, you may have reduced inventory and all that sort of stuff. But a real Class A system is a business tool which helps you be competitive in the marketplace. And that's why you have an ERP system. So, suitable reward for your team. A bottle of Balvenie. Great thing to reward a team with. And hopefully Jeff is going to take over now, and then we're going to go out for a little dram of Balvenie or something. Jeff, can I ask you to wrap up, please?
All right. Sorry, Tom.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate that. Thanks everybody for joining us. In the chat, you'll see our survey, so you can evaluate that. Tom, I think this is your last one in this series. I don't think we'll see you.
In the series, yeah.
I don't know if we have you on the schedule for a little bit, but we'll see you back here again. And we do have some other webinars and events coming up in the next weeks or so, and on different topics besides this one as well. And we'd really appreciate you to take a look at that. I'm also a supply chain manager with Missouri Enterprise, and we have a Connects program too. So if you have an opportunity to check that out, please take a look if you haven't registered for that yet. And we'd be happy to have you talk to you about that, or your ABMs as well. So again, thanks for joining us. Check out that events slab. Do we have any questions at all? I know we kind of scrimped over that a little bit, but if there are any questions, let us know in the chat as well. Otherwise, we'll just hang out here for a minute or so, and we'll see you guys around next time. So thank you very much. Yeah, so for the copy of the recording for the session, you can actually get that. We're going to post that to our blog. If you go to our website, MissouriEnterprise.org, we'll have a blog there listed, and it was one of the top selections. To learn more, you can look for Missouri Enterprise's blog. We also have a YouTube page on Missouri Enterprise. It's on YouTube, and we post all of our recordings and webinars and things there. So if you ever want to go back and see a webinar or missed one, that's a good spot for it. So thanks for asking that. And yeah, again, if you could take that survey, just click on that link. We do that for our impact, and so we can help continue to support manufacturers in Missouri. So it's really important for us. This one is for us, but also we have a NIST survey as well coming later. So thank you.